Hello. You're all very welcome to this 5 Books That Could Save Your Life event. I'm Madeline Mc Aleer, and I work for Haven Horizons, a national organisation that's dedicated to the prevention of domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse. And just to give a little bit of housekeeping, the toilets are behind us here, and you'll have to use these passes to go into the toilets and to come out of the toilets. There are a couple of fire exits behind you and here where the toilets are. So I'll give you a brief background to the 5 Books project. The 5 books that are being discussed here today come from the 75 books that Haven Horizons has selected and donated to Libraries Ireland, Libraries Northern Ireland, the Women's Aid Federation Northern Ireland and TUS Libraries. And we've been donating those books since 2019, and we add new books to the collection each year. A few years ago, I recommended one of the books, Invisible Chains, to a woman who was looking for information on coercive control. When she returned the book, she said, "I think that book saved my life." And I've always believed that knowledge is power. And that's why we started donating the books. So it really resonated with me when she said that. And I wondered if there were people whose lives might have been saved if they had read one of the books. And that's why we started 5 Books That Could Save Your Life. Because while coercive control is pervasive and it's a lethal problem in Irish society and globally, it largely remains misunderstood and therefore invisible. And I think what we would like to put across here today is that it's hiding in plain sight. So the 5 books that we selected for this discussion include 2 powerful memoirs written by survivors of coercive control and 3 seminal texts written by experts with decades of experience working in the area of domestic abuse and coercive control. The project is sponsored by the Shared Island Civic Fund through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And really we hope that it would develop an all-Ireland discussion, because we have 2 partners in Northern Ireland, Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid, and Reclaim the Agenda. So today's event is the last in-person event from the events held this year. So we had our first event in Ennis at the Ennis Book Club Festival. We had an event at Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid 50th Anniversary Conference, and we had an event in Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's. And so, as I say, this one in Dublin today is the last in-person event. The project will conclude on the 20th of November with a webinar with the authors of the books. And the authors will talk about their book and their work and why they wrote their books. There's a pack on every chair, and there's a QR code for the webinar in that pack. And there's also a QR code for the evaluation. And I'd really like it if people could complete the evaluation after the event. It also, you have a little booklet that gives you information on all 75 books and their ISBN numbers, because the way our library system works here in the Republic of Ireland, I think most people know, you can go into any library branch, and once you have the ISBN number, you can have that book come to that branch. So that is really useful for people, because they don't even have to take the book home if it's not safe. They can go to the branch and sit there and read the book. So, of course, some of the issues we're discussing here today, they may be triggering. And we have Lisa Morris here from the Amber Women's Refuge. And Lisa's here if anyone needs to talk. And there is a designated restroom which anyone can go to. Again, you need to access it through one of the pass keys. Lisa's there later, she's wearing the yellow lanyard. And I'd also like to acknowledge that there are coercive control survivors in the room, and also family members of victims of domestic homicide are here today as well. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Stephanie O'Keefe, CEO of COOL, our new statutory agency for domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. And I suppose we'll have to stop saying new very soon, because it was launched in January 2024, but it's new to the people who've been working in the area for 30 years, and it is amazingly beneficial to have an agency that's focusing on, prevention, prosecution, protection, the 4 pillars of the Istanbul Convention. So Dr. O'Keefe previously worked in the HSE as the National Director of Health and Wellbeing, and more recently was the National Director of Operations Planning. She has over 20 years' experience working in the Irish Public Service across several organisations, and was responsible for delivering Ireland's first whole-of-government population health strategy, Healthy Ireland. Dr. O'Keefe holds a PhD in psychology and has diploma and certificate qualifications from the Institute of Directors Ireland. So, over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Madeline, and to everybody here today. I'm delighted to be able to do the opening address for this event, and really congratulations to Haven Horizons and to Lisburn and Belfast Women's Aid and to Reclaim the Agenda for initiating this. I think the cross-border dimension to it is really important. Because it's what's happening on the island of Ireland in the context of what's happening all around the world, and all of the wider influences that go well beyond the Ireland of the South and the Ireland of the North. So I think that dimension to it is really important, and particularly in terms of being able to learn from each other, because there are different phenomena as we hear in terms of what's happening both south and north of the border. And I'm particularly delighted to be here in the context of the actual event itself, and all these wonderful books at the back of the room, and what Madeline has collated and curated and reviewed and assessed to come down to 5 books that are under discussion today. As a book lover, as I'm sure many of you are in the room, it's lovely to be here and to think through the power of prose, the power of poetry, the power of academic literature to change hearts, to change minds, to change policy. And I think that's really the inspiration behind all of this, and I very much welcome it. It really speaks, I think, to the heart of what it is that we're trying to do in COOL as a new agency with a new kind of corporate plan. And as Madeline said, we'd have to stop saying it's new, but this is the first year of the implementation of the corporate plan, and it's a new organisation with new staff and new processes and new policies, and all of that coming together. And in that context, notwithstanding the fact that we are terribly busy and running around really kind of fast, trying to get various different programmes of work done, in thinking about what it is that we want to achieve, and in thinking about the values with regard to how we will achieve it, we did come up working with our board a series of values, one of which is creativity, the others being courage, empathy, integrity and inclusion. And I actually think that in terms of what it is that Madeline and the organisations working together and people working here, I think there's a lot of resonance between those values and what it is that you're trying to do, and how it is that we need to work collectively across society and across government to be able to respond to these very persistent issues that have been there all of the time, and for where there are many kind of new threats emerging in terms of the safety of women and girls and other victims, survivors as well. So I think that's a really nice kind of resonance around kind of the values of where I think that we need to go into working collaboratively and collectively within Coon and across the wider domestic, sexual and gender-based violence ecosystem, and also this event today and this particular initiative. I think also there's a very strong resonance obviously with stories. So in April earlier this year, we launched a new campaign called Harte Stories. And the idea behind the campaign, of which there are 2 TV ads and lots of radio and out of door, is that the hardest stories are the most important ones to tell. The ad tells the story of 2 people, one impacted by sexual violence, rape, and the other impacted by domestic abuse. And the idea behind that campaign is that it's an evergreen campaign, so it's not just that in a burst of media in April, but that we will develop it as time goes on. Because ultimately behind that, we're trying to create an environment where victim survivors can talk to people, they can talk to their family, they can talk to friends, they can talk to work colleagues, they can talk to the police, they can talk to services, many of whom are in the audience today. Because victim survivor voice is key to the national strategy, so I'm not the first person to say this or the first person to kind of think this up. It is key to the national strategy, victim survivor voice. And for us as an agency established to coordinate the implementation of that strategy and to initiate all of our own actions that we have within it, of which there are many, we have to hold ourselves to account that through what we are doing, that we are placing victim survivor voice at the centre of what it is that we are doing. So with that campaign as a very small example, and with the more recent one that we launched to publicise to people that there are supports there if somebody is affected by sexual violence, and to again support that kind of environment whereby people who are concerned about somebody or know about somebody who's been through a sexual violence experience knows of the services, knows how to avail and knows how to intervene. But for both of those campaigns, we would have engaged with services who are the experts at providing very important and a very broad range of services to victim survivors of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and also the emerging evidence base, what's actually happening on the ground that are closest to it, but also to victim survivors themselves in terms of how we're working and whether it's going to be effective and how we're going to measure it and what have you. So there's a very strong resonance there on stories. Stories are powerful. People's stories are powerful, and we need to create more environments for people to be able to tell their stories in all those different formats, including all kinds of creative formats in terms of working with them through the arts. So that's very important, and well done for the inspiration behind the initiative. I think it's a critically important one. And of course, some of the books that Madeline has looked at, I'm sure kind of with colleagues and we've curated and reviewed, are academic texts, which is also really important. And we have strategy functions in relation to research, and it's really important that Coon can demonstrate how it is ensuring that we are growing and strengthening the research network in Ireland for evidence-based policy, and how we're kind of supporting that through working with people who have that expertise in academia and so on and so forth. So thank you very much for asking me to do the opening remarks. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion, and particularly the North-South dimension to it. And thank you to everybody for being here and for supporting this initiative, because that's how we need to make the change that we want to see, which is by working together, noting our differences, noting that people might be concerned about pace and what have you, but it's only through exchange, and through particularly exchange of ideas, that we can address the real challenges at the heart of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence that is so horrific. And interrupts and ends people's lives in such horrendous ways, and particularly for children. It is only really by kind of thinking creatively, working together and persistently and consistently, that we can deliver the change that we all really want to see. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Madeline Mc Aleer is the Research, Training and Development Director with Haven Horizons, a national organisation dedicated to the primary prevention and elimination of domestic abuse and coercive control. She lectures in domestic abuse and coercive control at the Technological University of Shannon, delivering the Level 6 Interagency Training Certificate in reflecting on and responding to domestic abuse and coercive control. Danielle works at Reclaim the Agenda, a feminist campaigning group based in Belfast. She has extensive experience as a policy worker advocating for LGBTQIA+, got that right, and women's rights. Danielle is co-organiser of Reclaim the Night Belfast and a co-convener of Alliance for Choice Belfast. Her doctoral research at Ulster University explores barriers to women's political participation. And Noelle, in the centre there, Noelle Collins, has worked for Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid for many years. During this time, she has championed changes in legislation, helping to support and protect women and children affected by domestic violence and abuse. As Training and Programmes Manager, Noelle oversees the Criminal Justice Project and the support work for women whose partners are engaged in perpetrator programmes. So, with 5 books, as Madeline said, we have 3 by experts and 2 memoirs. I think I'll go to you first, Noelle. Of the 5 books, was there any particular book that you liked or resonated particularly with you, and why?
Well, for me, obviously, it was the Jane Monckton Smith book, because I think it shows the 8 steps, the process of domestic violence from the onset to the end. You know. And I suppose you almost, if you work in this field, you need a tool, and that tool is in this book. And I would advise anyone who is working, particularly on frontline services, to get it. It's almost like a Bible. It actually takes you through the process of a woman's journey. And women are really, really good, like all of us are, at risk assessing themselves. We all risk assess on a daily basis. But women would leave relationships, usually around between 3 and 5 in this timeline, when they know it's time to get out. They have risk assessed, they know the danger that they're in. And so this book lays out that process. In actual fact, in the north of Ireland we have domestic homicide reviews. I know you don't have them in the south as of yet. Hopefully you will in the future. But each of the DHRs use this timeline to look at the woman's life, her journey until, unfortunately, her death. So I definitely would recommend this book to anyone.
Yes, brilliant book. And I think just to reference something Stephanie said there, a sort of secondary point in control, Jane Monckton Smith also kind of emphasises very strongly our cultural storytelling by which we minimise domestic abuse and how entrenched that is.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight that the process is very good, but the means can differ. The way behaviours and men's behaviours towards women can differ, and everything evolves. And we have the domestic violence evolved since I first came into this, into the organisation of Women's Aid, and we look at like cyber abuse now that is almost taken over. So things are very, very different. But this book highlights the process. It's well worth the read.
So basically you're saying that obviously the landscape is changing very quickly, but this book in particular, at the heart of it is the timeline, which that hasn't changed. The process stays the same.
Absolutely.
That's its value. Danielle, I might ask you, what did you like or resonated with you?
So the book that I picked was the NLB book, Brutally Honest. I think across the 5 books, even the academic and the practitioner books, they all tell those real stories and have case studies of real examples. So Melanie's is a memoir, and it talks about her experience of coercive control and gaslighting. And I think just to highlight that there is no typical victim. Melanie was the case of guard bar in the late 90s, but at the same time, behind closed doors, was experiencing very controlling and escalating violent behaviour. But one of the cases that had everything that you could ask for in the world, jewellery and dresses and big houses. But then she talks about being so unable to make decisions about her own life and being controlled to the extent where she didn't know what colour clothes to pick without being told. So yeah, I think that it can happen to Mel B, it can happen to anybody. I think it really tries to tackle that stigma of it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about Brutally Honest, initially it wasn't my favourite of the 5 books, but when I thought back, we have lunch and learn sessions every week which are open to the public, and we have different experts come and speak to us. But we had recently a lunch and learn by Gillian Dennehy from the Davina Project, and she spoke very powerfully about addiction and its role in domestic abuse. And so after her lunch and learn, I went back and thought about it, brutally honest, and addiction was a huge part of not MB's problem. The problem was the coercive control, but was certainly linking her book with Gillian Dennehy's Lunch and Learn. You realise that sort of addiction, I don't know what you think of this panel, but addiction is used in the relationship to control the person, and it is used post-separation to trash the person's reputation, so it's very powerful.
Yeah, I agree with that, because not only was addiction used, but she was being forced to drink with Stephen Belmonte. I mean, so then he was videoing when she was drunk or when she'd taken drugs, and then he was using that to say she was an unfit mother. So even though she reached a point where she attempted suicide and she survived, she still couldn't leave until she'd proven that for 2 years she could be a fit mother in this really abusive relationship. So that's how he used drink and drugs.
So basically leveraging addiction quite effectively during and post. So what about you, Madeline? Which book resonates with you?
Well, the one that I picked for this is What's to be Done About Violence Against Women. And it's by two professors, Professor Kate Fitzgibbons and Professor Sandra Walkley. And Kate Fitzgibbons speaks at the World Health Organization, she speaks at Davos. She's really at the forefront of research in Australia. And they took the title of this book from a book that was written 40 years ago by Elizabeth, I'm going to say, Wilson. Yeah, I keep getting that wrong. By Elizabeth Wilson. And 40 years ago, she was asking the question, saying what's to be done, because it was only the first time that people started to talk publicly about battered wives and things like that. So they took that title and said, well, what's happened since? What have we done? And if we've done all this, why is there still such high levels of domestic violence, domestic abuse, coercive control, and domestic homicide? And what they come to is that we can't police and prosecute our way out of something that's a social and cultural problem. And not only is it a social and cultural problem, but as Noelle alluded to, and I know Stephanie, it's an evolving cultural problem. So our responses have to evolve, and especially around that whole area of technology, cyber abuse, pornography, the way technology is used for tracking. It's used just, I know there's people in the room here who are working very actively on these very topics, and new books are coming out at the moment on those topics, and those are the books, some of the books we'll be selecting for this year's donation, some fantastic books that have just been written.
So, speaking of kind of cultural problems, Noelle, a cultural problem, or something that certainly runs very deep, is that even now in 2025, a lot of people still associate domestic abuse with bruises or physical injuries rather than necessarily psychological abuse or coercive control. Obviously, physical violence will very often be present where there's coercive control, but sometimes there'll be no physical violence. Broadly speaking, what does coercive control look like in a victim or a survivor's life?
I suppose it's, for many women, they don't actually realise that they're being coercively controlled because they're in it. They're in a relationship where it became second nature to do what is expected of them, and it becomes very natural to them. And it's only when, women get out of that relationship and look back that they realise how bizarre their behaviour has become. But it becomes a very natural phenomenon for them to do that. And I suppose, for some women, coercive control can be very, very simple acts, like it's time that they spend at a supermarket or having the dinner on the table at a certain time, and that may just become part of that relationship without actually seeing that the control is there. And I think for me, working with women over the years and doing some sort of group work, that the light switch comes on and they realise, oh my God, I didn't know that was happening to me. And it happened so slowly. Again, it was part of a process. And because domestic violence is a process and takes so long, it actually takes so long to heal. and to come away from that and to recognise what it was that was happening in the relationship. So I think coercive control is actually the trendy word for the last couple of years, to be honest with you, but it's not a new issue in relationships. It's been happening forever.
Well, I guess I suppose a valuable term. We're sort of naming something that's been there forever. And on that, Madeline, Lisa Ronson-Fontes in her book Invisible Chains, which is my favourite book, she's very good at conveying the persistent pattern of coercive control, how it's gradual, it's kind of incremental, isn't she?
Yes, and I suppose from what Noelle is saying, the thing about the tactics of coercive control, they're just, I mean, when I lecture, what we start off with is a sheet, and we look at the power and control wheel, which was developed in the 80s, and had identified that there are certain types of perpetrators that are using power and control. And of course, there are perpetrators who reflect the incident model, the one that we stereotypically all identify with because it's visible. The physical violence, the sort of dysfunctional, dysregulated perpetrator who does lash out. That's a very visible perpetrator, and the media portrays that incident model. But actually, there's a very, very big cohort of perpetrators who we don't recognise. The hidden perpetrators, the ones who, of course, at the beginning are, this charming person. The public persona is the persona that they display to their partner at the beginning of the relationship. And that's actually stage 2 of Jane Mockman Smith's timeline. It's not stage 1, because stage 1 is really about what was this perpetrator doing before they got into this relationship. And usually you'll find they were doing exactly the same thing with somebody else and behaving in that way in their life. And their sense of entitlement and privilege and male superiority, usually it's men. Of course, there are female victims, there are male victims. It happens in LGBT relationships. But in the main, that power and control and that privilege and those tactics, Kate Amber, who works in this area, says it's bespoke. So the tactics are bespoke because this perpetrator gets to know everything, gains the confidence of the victim, gets to know everything about their life, their fears, their dreams, and they almost offer all that in stage 2. And then very quickly, usually rushed relationships, and very quickly a commitment. It seems like it's a honeymoon phase, a commitment. And once the commitment is made, then you're my partner, you're my fiance, we're living together, and then very slowly that changes into the demands, the control, the man of the house, all of those things then that lead to this, every aspect of a person's life being controlled. But this bespoke terrorism is really, Evan Stark says, intimate terrorist, domestic terrorism. So it becomes that someone is trapped within this and isolated. And in Invisible Chains, Dr. Lisa Ronson-Fontes, who is a psychologist and was working with children and family relationships, in her second relationship, she ended up in a coercively controlling relationship and found it really difficult to recognise it and to get out, and that's why she wrote the book.
Well, I think what Lisa Ronson-Fontes there, just to take your second point, the first point was about perpetrators, how they often are invisible in society, how they're not socially dysregulated, they haven't come into contact with law forces, they're often very successful, very manipulative. But your second point, which is dealt with very effectively in Invisible Chains, Dr. Lisa Ronson-Fontes' book, is the fact about the victim. So no typical victim, and I think the most interesting part really was when she speaks about there are certain people who are very susceptible, and wasn't that professional women?
I mean, she identified why professional women are very, very susceptible, because they're usually task-orientated, they're goal-orientated, they're successful, they're busy at home, they're busy at work. But there's a problem, they're looking for the solution. So this perpetrator is putting forward problems all the time. This is not okay. And they're solution focused, trying to find the solution. But of course, they're trying to fix the relationship to get it back to what it was at the beginning, where this perpetrator was portraying this perfect relationship. But of course, that's not what the perpetrator is interested in. They keep changing the goalposts. They keep spending the money. They keep trying to create financial control. When you look at the isolation from family members, maybe they'll use their own mental health or their own neurodiversity to say, oh, well, I don't really like people around, I don't want to do this. Oh, no,
So basically you're saying an array of tactics that the perpetrators use. I'd like to go to you, Danielle. So here, obviously, there's been more reporting of domestic abuse and coercive control, which is brilliant, and we have CUAN and the campaigns in part to thank for that, as well as many other measures. Nonetheless, Garda figures show how domestic abuse call-outs have increased by roughly 45% in the last 4 years. Between 1996 and March 2025, 275 women died violently in the Republic. Now, they weren't all domestic homicides, but most of them were. Almost 9 in 10 knew their killer. But this is something that I think is interesting. It's awful, but it's interesting. In the last year, there's been a very high rate of femicide per head of population in Northern Ireland. In fact, the rate of domestic homicide has doubled over the last year. Danielle, is there perhaps an added layer to domestic abuse in the North, given the history of more generalised violence?
So Northern Ireland has 3 times higher per capita rates of femicide than England and Wales, and is, depending on what measure you use, joint highest per capita in Europe for femicide. And the majority of women who have been murdered and children have known their murderer, and in most cases it's been a partner or a family member. So the problems that are happening around the world are also happening in Northern Ireland. We've talked about technology and online radicalisation and things like that. But something that we can't ignore in Northern Ireland is the ongoing impact of paramilitary groups as well. There's a report, When You Know What They're Capable Of, by Foyle Family Justice Centre and Foyle Women's Aid, which if people are interested in finding out more about the ongoing impact of paramilitaries, it's a really comprehensive report. Ashley Swain is one of the authors, and it talks about coercive control within communities by paramilitaries. So I think there's that added layer of surveillance and threats that then makes it harder for people to leave and keeps women trapped in relationships because they can't just move to another street or another town because there's these networks of organised gangs. Another impact in Northern Ireland is the deprioritisation of legislative reform. So while in the past few years we've had massive steps forward in stopping legislation, in an end-to-end against women girls strategy, which actually has funding attached to it. So there has been big steps forward recently, but those issues weren't being talked about. We lag behind in every area of domestic abuse legislation. Now, legislation on paper doesn't automatically mean everything's fixed. For example, we have some measures like domestic abuse protection orders and domestic abuse safe leave. The law was passed a long time ago and hasn't been implemented. It might not be implemented as an ambient. So legislation was slow to move in Northern Ireland, which then, alongside that, when we did get the legislation, for example, on non-fatal strangulation, that came alongside lots of training for frontline professionals, awareness campaigns, and that's where we see the change more. It's not just on the law on paper, it's actually implemented. So I think the circumstances in Northern Ireland has had an impact in different ways, but the main ones for me being the ongoing criminal organisations that execute paramilitaries, and then the political agenda not keeping pace with best practice on tackling violence against women and girls. Part of the reason why we're called Breaking the Agenda is because our issues weren't on the political agenda. Issues that families care about weren't being talked about because when the organisation was set up in 2010, 2011, it was, the typical green-orange issues was also still being talked about despite it being decades after the agreement. So, that lack of focus on change, and legislative reform, and then education as well.
And then I was just thinking of your 2 points there. The first point was when you spoke about different communities, there was presumably, and is presumably, an aspect to if you have an entrenched community, and that it can be, and I was thinking actually of a conversation I had with Dr. Jennifer Madeline and I had with Dr. Jennifer KK last week. This was in the context of the intersectional piece about ethnic minorities and going outside your own community. So I'm thinking in the north, presumably there are taboos about not only going outside your own family, which we spoke about, Jennifer, but cultural taboos. But, going outside your own community and going to the police, presumably is something there as well.
So historically there would be this trust in place from different communities, but particularly amongst national communities. And we have seen reporting, it fluctuates every year, but reporting rates have generally increased. But yeah, there is still communities where people won't report to the police. And if an abuser is related to connected to a the organisation, whichever child, then that's but then there's new issues as well. Like, for example, people on spousal visas aren't going to report in case they end up getting deported, and that's where you see things in even broader, like children being used against access to children being used as a threat to people in relationships. So yeah, there's lots
of moving parts to it. So Noelle, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier domestic homicide abuse. We don't have them down here, maybe we will, hopefully we will. Just talk to me a little bit about that, their value and...
Because Women's Aid campaign for about 10, 15 years to get DHRs into Northern Ireland, and they eventually came in 2 years ago. And it is when organisations come together to review their practices around that particular person who has been killed. And the idea is it's a non-claiming process, but it is to improve services. And I have to say, even within Women's Aid, we have picked up things and changed our procedures. But it is, there have been, I think, 7 published. My concern is that they are probably polished, the reports, when they are...
What do you mean by that?
I don't think that the severity maybe of the negligence that has happened towards by some... So, for instance, if the police may not have evoked a marriage that the advice wasn't given to women, or social services have been negligent, or the PPS has not followed through, or guardians applied and haven't turned up at court. So there are things that then are brought back to the organisations, and they are given the opportunity to change practice, which usually is to bring in some training for their staff. And I think, while I think they're worthwhile and there is a learning, I think there needs to be more named and shamed, and people need to take responsibility for the actions of their organisations. I think there is a big gap within the DHRs for women who have died by suicide. I think that is something that we are to certainly bring into the attention of the Department of Justice, and have had lots of conversations around it. And many of you, we know so many women who have died by suicide, and they have had a long history of domestic violence. And we know that in England there have been some prosecutions there for manslaughter in those cases. So we would like that to be brought into Northern Ireland, certainly to go along with the DHR.
I think on the prosecutions there's been 3 who've been unsuccessful. One's been successful in 2017. There was a successful one in Scotland as well.
Yeah.
The perpetrator who pushed his wife off the cliff, and she survived briefly, so she was able to tell a passerby. But I think in the last month or two there have been some fairly strong statements in England in particular about how they are determined to start pursuing perpetrators. Madeline, do you want to say something about that?
I just want to say that I originally am from the north, and I've been living...
We guessed.
I've been living down here for quite a long time, but one of the things I think probably people don't always sort of connect with about Northern Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales is that they're all independent jurisdictions, and they all bring in their own legal processes at different times. So it creates quite a lot of anomalies, because Scotland have had DHRs for many, many years. And just to speak to a point that Noelle said there about domestic homicide and suicide, yes, Jim Oxford and others are doing research, and they're now finding that more women are dying by domestic abuse related to suicide than are dying by homicides related to domestic abuse. And this is the research that's coming out. When Danielle was talking about the reality of living in the north. And I know most people will know Professor Evan Stark. I mean, he wrote the seminal text on coercive control. It's over there. It's huge. And I didn't put it in this because it's quite a detailed book. But when he came to Ennis and he came out on stage, he didn't hold up his own book. He held up Anna Byrne's Milkman, which won the Booker. And it was about this woman in a community in Northern Ireland, and an ex-paramilitary, was sort of stalking her and trying to have a relationship with her. And how there was just so much collusion in the community around that, and how it was almost impossible for her to escape. And that's what Anna Byrne's book was about. And I thought it was really great that Evan Stark was picking that up and promoting that.
Yeah, it was a great book. So we've kind of about 5 minutes left, and I like to stick to time. That's the school environment thing. So I'm going to ask the three of you about media. I want to just ask them. Noelle, I'll start with you. How do you feel the media are currently covering domestic abuse, domestic homicide, and coercive control?
Well, I think there's been a lot of work done recently, certainly by Northern Ireland Women's Aid Federation in relation to the guidelines to use by media. And I think recently a woman died in the north of Ireland, and it was the woman and her 2 children. And all the press contacted the Women's Aid Federation, and they steered them into how they should report that. And I think it was excellent how they did it. What they did was they focused on her and the 2 children, very little about him, and that came up in every news item. They did mention him, but they focused on her, and quite often they don't do that. And if they do it, they do it in a very derogatory way, or the reason why this woman died, this poor man, and But I think things are getting better, although we have had some awful reporting.
Yeah, we've had some humdingers here, and I know the NUJ don't have guidelines because I've written to them twice in the last year. They do on things like suicide, but not. And that's a piece of work that needs to be done. Madeline, what do you think?
Well, actually, one of the books we haven't mentioned is Remembered Forever. And it was written by Luke and Ryan Harte, and 2 brothers who helped their mother and sister leave the family home. And then 5 weeks later, they were murdered by their father, Lance Harte. And they actually would say they were really reluctant activists. They were so shocked at what happened, and they were living abroad. They came home, helped their mother and sister move out, went back to their jobs, and these reports came out about a woman and her daughter being murdered, and they realised they came home and they were sitting in the police station, and Luke says he looked up and he saw a poster that said coercive control, and he read what it said. And he was stunned because they had lived their whole lives under coercive. He had to reframe every single thing that happened in his life, but what made them become activists was the way the media covered the murder.
So you mean like victim blaming?
Victim blaming, Mr. DIY, lashed out, lost control. And Samantha Billington recently had up on LinkedIn, these type of perpetrators don't lose control, they use control. And this incident model, then the stereotype, it's reinforced by the media coverage, and so it's why we still all have this incident model and can't see the pattern. And once you see the pattern, you realise that the media are partly responsible for not understanding coercive control.
Yeah, the way before I just asked the last question, it kind of loops neatly back to what Stephanie said at the beginning about cultural storytelling and stories and their resonance, because the media have a very important role to play in terms of the messages that are sort of propagated and disseminated to all of us, to young people. So, Danielle, last question for you. You have a magic wand. What's the one thing you would do to change the current environment in terms of how we respond to domestic abuse, coercive control?
I think education is the main thing that we need to do. In Northern Ireland, we don't have comprehensive relationship and sexuality education. Despite the law being changed 5 years ago, when we got 2 paragraphs of CEDAR recommendations incorporated in the primary legislation. We've had a mini inquiry, we've had a consultation, and it just keeps dragging on and on. So 5 years as a whole cohort of secondary school people who haven't got the education that they have a human right to. So we're not teaching young people about healthy relationships, we're not talking about LGBTQI plus identity, we're not talking about consent, So education is something that we need to do, but not only for young people. We're involved in a project called Raise Your Voice, which is community education when we talk about sexual harassment and sexual violence. And there isn't a workshop that we do where somebody doesn't come up after and say, I didn't realise that what happened to me was wrong, I didn't realise this happened to other people, I didn't realise that was sexual harassment.
And that it was even illegal, maybe?
Well, just because it's normalised as well. So we use different tools to do community education in sports clubs and women's centres and social groups. So it's been great under the strategy to have funding to roll that out more. But yeah, we need education and we need myth busting and even things like victim blaming, going back to the data point. We're all socialised into these ideas.
They're such part of the myth, absolutely, yeah. Madeline, quickly.
Well, I'm looking at in control dangerous relationships and how they end in murder. And, you know, I've been to Glenn Smith's training a number of times. And when you're talking to her, she says, when she does this with families, because she does domestic homicide reviews, she's an ex-police woman in the UK, and she said, the one sentence that families keep saying is, I wish we'd known, if only we'd known, if we'd known about this 8-stage timeline, and that the most dangerous time is stage 4 when there's a trigger, and that if the control isn't and if someone's talking about leaving, talking about divorce, then those are triggers, and that the risk exponentially increases. Families say, if we'd known, if our sister, if our mother, if our daughter, if they'd known. So
public education.
Well, yeah, if I'd make sure that everybody knew what coercive control actually is, and it's this progressive pattern of behaviour that changes from stage 1 to stage 7. And there's usually a lot of planning involved. It's not an incident.
Yes. Noelle, 2 sentences.
I suppose I would like parity on the island of Ireland for every woman who is suffering from any sort of violence against women. I think that a woman in Tipperary should be getting the same services as a woman in Belfast. I think that we need to get into our courts. I think we need to give maybe some brain transplants to some of our judges. We need to change the attitude of our courts, because our courts are actually deterring women from coming forward. The way women are treated through our criminal justice system is falling and taking a year, 2 years before they get to court. Who would go through that? Who would be re-traumatised, especially around sexual abuse that can go on for nearly 3 years? So I think there's an awful lot of work to do. So if I had a magic wand, I would make all that all right.
And I'd just like to say before I hand over to Madeline, who's going to, I think, hand over to Dr. Jennifer, okay? Sorry about today, because just the way the format is, that was a gallop at 30 minutes. Normally we talk in more detail about the justice system and that. So, Madeline, I'm handing over to Jennifer, I think, yeah.
And as Sarah said, I mean, I know this discussion could have gone on for a lot longer, and often we do a question answers with it, and sometimes those questions are we really want to hear them. So, or people want to make comments about something we've said. So we will all be around afterwards, and we'll be here and we can talk to people. We have Joey, who is doing the video. And so if anyone wants to make a comment about the issue or about today's event, or we will be using those for social media and also for our evaluation. So I'd really like to remind you. So this is the QR code for the evaluation. It's really important to us because we'll be feeding this back to the funders. We'll be feeding it back to anyone who's interested, the outcomes of the Five Books That Could Save Your Life project. And I think, as Stephanie said, it is really important to evaluate the impact of these things and to learn from them. And if we're going to do it again, to include recommendations from the feedback. So thanks to everybody for coming and being part of it, and for the evaluations I know you're all going to do. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Jennifer O'Keke, Jennifer is the chairperson of the National Women's Council, and they've been supporting us in the logistics and the organisation of the event, and to have it included in the Irish Arts and Human Rights Festival agenda. So Dr. O'Keke, her professional and academic expertise encompasses gender-based violence, anti-trafficking and migration, human rights and peace and security. She plays an active role in advancing gender equality through her advocacy, research and policy engagement, including her representation at the European Women's Lobby. Dr. O'Keke's doctoral research examined the experience of black women trafficked into and through Ireland for purposes of sexual exploitation. She holds a PhD in law and government from Dublin City University.
Thank you very much, Madeline. I'm going to try and stick to time. So I'm very thankful to be here today. And like Madeline said, I'm the chair of the National Women's Council. Founded in 1973, the National Women's Council is the leading representative organization working for women's rights and equality across the island of Ireland. We work together with almost 200 member groups across the island and a growing community of individual supporters to deliver our purpose, which is to achieve women's rights and equality. The elimination of violence against women is fundamental to the realization of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Across Ireland and globally, violence against women remains one of the most pervasive human rights violations, cutting across socio-economic, cultural, and political boundaries. It undermines women's autonomy, health, economic participation, and full engagement in public life. Achieving gender equality, therefore, requires not only policy and legal reform, but also sustained societal transformation to dismantle the structural and cultural conditions that perpetuate violence and inequality. We do know violence against women constitutes both a cause and a consequence of gender inequality. The persistence of such violence reflects entrenched power imbalance between men and women, while simultaneously reinforcing those hierarchies by restricting women's freedom, security, and opportunities. In Ireland as elsewhere, violence against women manifests in diverse forms: physical, psychological, sexual, and economic abuse that affects women and girls across all backgrounds. Its impact is multidimensional, affecting not only individuals but also families, communities, and the broader social fabric. Research both in Ireland and across the globe have consistently demonstrated that women who experience harms that comes from violence and face greater barriers in education, employment, and civic participation. Survivors have been known to encounter long-term health consequences, including trauma, depression, chronic illness, of which can limit their ability to engage fully in social and economic life. In this sense, violence against women is not a private or isolated issue, but a profound structural challenge that inhibits social progress and sustainable development. Addressing it, therefore, is essential to fulfilling Ireland's commitments under international framework, both to CEDAW, the Istanbul Convention, but also to Ireland's zero tolerance strategy. Events dedicated to the prevention of gender-based violence, such as today's, play an indispensable role in promoting societal awareness and mobilizing collective actions. Awareness-raising initiatives foster public understanding of the harms caused by gender violence, not only to women and girls, but to the society as a whole. They challenge harmful norms, dispense myths, and cultivate cultures of respect, empathy, and accountability. Prevention in this context is not limited to reactive measures, but includes proactive strategies aimed at education, community engagement, and the transformation of social attitudes. Schools, workplaces, and community organizations are critical spaces for cultivating such awareness. early education programs that promote gender equality and challenges stereotype can help prevent violence before it occurs. Similarly, engaging men and boys as allies in the movement to end gender-based violence is essential, as it shifts responsibility from victim to the broader community and fosters shared accountability. For cultural change, public event campaigns and policy dialogues are therefore not symbolic acts, but necessary intervention in the ongoing effort to build inclusive, equitable, and non-violent societies. The National Women's Council places the elimination of violence against women at the core of its mission to achieve equality for women and girls. Recognizing that safety is a prerequisite for participation, the Council works to ensure that women can live free from violence and fear both in public and in private spaces. Through lobbying, research, and collaboration with governmental and non-governmental partners, the National Women's Council seeks to influence policy, legislation, and to strengthen prevention, protection, and support mechanisms for victims and survivors. Since 2002, the National Women's Council has been chairing the NGO Observatory on Violence Against Women, which is an independent network of grassroots and national organizations. In partnership with the newly established agency on violence against women, well, Madeline has said it, we need to stop using newly. But I think we can be excused until the 1st of January 2026. So, we are currently working to develop a report on survivor structure engagement. We are also cognizant that the violence against women doesn't know borders. And NWC, in partnership with Women's Aid Northern Ireland, is working on an intimate partner violence initiative to harmonize access to support for women and children across the island of Ireland. At the grassroots level, the National Women's Council engaged in community-based organization to amplify the voices of women most affected by violence. This participatory approach ensures that national policies are informed both by lived experience and grounded in realities of the diverse communities within our society. At the national and EU level, the Council contributes to strategic initiatives and policy framework that promotes gender equality, human rights, and social justice. Its engagement at the EU level includes through the European Women's Lobby, reinforces Ireland's contribution to regional global efforts to eliminate violence against women and girls. Eliminating violence against women is not only a gender equality imperative, but also a foundation for broader social and economic well-being. Societies in which women and girls are safe are more cohesive, prosperous, and democratic. Gender equality contributes to high levels of social trust, improved governance, and more sustainable development outcomes. Conversely, tolerance to gender-based violence perpetuates cycles of poverty, marginalization, and exclusion that undermines national progress. In this sense, tackling gender-based violence is a collective responsibility that extends beyond the women's movement to encompass all sectors of the society, from education and healthcare to justice and the economy. Legislative reform must be accompanied by adequate resources, specialized training, and institutional accountability to ensure effective implementation. Moreover, survivor-centered approach must remain at the center of all response, ensuring that those affected by violence are supported, empowered, and that their voices are more importantly heard. Ending violence against women is indispensable to achieving gender equality and human rights for all. It requires more than symbolic commitments. It demands sustained political will, community engagement, and structural change. Events like today serve as a vital platform for awareness, solidarity, and action, reminding us that the safety and dignity of women and girls are prerequisites for a just and an equitable society. The National Women's Council of Ireland remains steadfast in its commitment to working collaboratively at grassroots, national and EU level to build a society where women and girls are free from violence, fear and discrimination. True equality cannot be realized until every woman and girl in Ireland and globally is safe to participate fully in all aspects of society, socially, economically and politically. The prevention and eradication of gender-based violence are therefore not peripheral goals, but the very foundation of gender equality and social progress. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think Jennifer's remarks, they really, I suppose they put the issues we discussed earlier into a more global gender equality framework. And it really reinforces the importance of partnership, we know, at local and national and international levels. But for me, really the message that societal transformation, gender equality, and the proactive prevention of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence and abuse and coercive control, it's really one of the core things that we say in Haven Horizons, that prevention is everyone's business. And so thank you for that, Jennifer. I want to thank everybody for attending today. And just to remind you about the webinar, so we will have Dr. Sarah Harte, Luke Clark, Professor James Smith, Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, and Professor Sandra Walkley. Unfortunately, Mel Lee can't be with us for the webinar, but she actually has sent us a short video we'll play on the day. I mean short, so don't be too many expectations. So that's the QR code. You can obviously sign up to it from anywhere. You know that the 75 books are here, and that the 5 books are on sale at the back, but I think 1 or 2 of them are already sold out. But you can, maybe we can order them for you and post them to you if you want to have them. So I just want to say a big thanks to Noelle Collins and to Danielle Roberts for this event and for the other events and all the work that has gone on in between their invaluable input to the work and to these panel discussions. And of course, we didn't introduce Sarah. Sarah works with Haven Horizons, and she's also an Irish Examiner opinion columnist. So thank you to Sarah, keeping us all together and keeping us on time. And I want to thank Ivana in the National Women's Council for their support, and also to Dr. Stephanie O'Keefe, who agreed to do the opening remarks, and to Jennifer, who was doing the closing remarks, and again, the Shared Island Civic Society Fund that have made the project possible. And I really want to give a special thank you to Robert and to Aaron from the Department of Justice, who I think he reminded me the first time I contacted them about this event was maybe back in April, May, and so we've been tic-tacking, but a lot in the last few weeks. So thank you for everything. Big thanks is to all the staff and volunteers with Haven Horizons. They made today happen. There was a lot to do. We're based in the west of Ireland, so we were organising all this from afar. They really are a small but a mighty team, so thank you.